The silence was the first thing I bought the cabin for, and the first thing I grew to hate. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a hollow, accusatory quiet that amplified the sound of my own breathing and made the lonely thud of my heart feel like a drumbeat of failure. I'd left the city, left a perfectly good graphic design job, and a perfectly empty apartment, convincing myself I needed to disconnect. What I'd found was that when you disconnect from everything else, the only thing left to connect to is yourself. And I wasn't great company. The cabin itself was a testament to optimistic neglect. The previous owner had clearly loved the idea of it more than the reality. The roof had a friendly relationship with the sky in a few places. The plumbing coughed and sputtered like an old man telling a long story, and one of the walls in the main room had a bow in it that suggested it was deep in thought. I'd spent the first week just sweeping. Dust, leaves, the mummified remains of insects who'd had the same idea as me and died of boredom. It was on day 8, after a particularly demoralizing battle with a window that refused to either open or close, that I admitted defeat. The man at the local hardware store, a cheerful fellow named Gary with a beard full of what looked like sawdust and kindness, had listened to my litany of structural woes with a patient nod. "You need coal," he'd said, as if prescribing a potent antibiotic. "He's the best." Bit quiet, but his hands know what they're doing. He'd scribbled a number on the back of a receipt for wood glue and nails. Just don't be put off if he just stares at things for a while. He's thinking. 2 days later, a dusty Ford truck that looked as solid and dependable as the mountains around us rumbled up my dirt driveway. I watched from the porch, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. A man swung out of the driver's side, and for a moment, I forgot about the bowed wall and the neurotic plumbing. He was tall, built with the kind of dense, practical muscle you get from lifting heavy things for a living, not from curated gym sessions. He wore a faded gray t-shirt that stretched across his shoulders and worn jeans that hugged his thighs. His hair was a dark, unruly brown, and his face was all angles and planes, softened only by a few days of stubble. He moved with an unhurried grace that was at odds with the powerful frame. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and just looked, first at the sagging roofline, then at the crooked doorframe, then, finally, at me. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, and Gary was right. He just stared, his expression unreadable. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was analytical. I felt like another problem to be assessed, another Joyce to be measured. "You're Leo?" His voice was lower than I expected, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath my feet. "I am," I said, trying to sound like a capable homeowner and not a lost child. "You must be Cole." He gave a single, short nod. "Gary said you had some trouble." He gestured vaguely at the entire cabin with a lift of his chin. "Trouble is one word for it," I said, attempting a wry smile that felt more like a grimace. "It's a bit of a project." Cole's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was the blueprint for one. A suggestion. "All right if I take a look around." I spent the next hour following him through my own house like a shadow, watching him work. He didn't talk much. He'd run a hand over the bowed wall, his long fingers tracing the warped wood with a strange sort of reverence. He'd press his ear to it, listening. He moved through the small space with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Every step had a purpose. When he went into the crawl space, I just stood in the living room, listening to the muffled sounds of him shifting around below me, his presence a solid weight under the floor. When he emerged, covered in cobwebs and dirt, he had a small, almost imperceptible smudge of grease on his cheek. My fingers twitched with the absurd, sudden urge to wipe it away. "The foundation is solid," he announced, his voice still that same low thrum. "That's good. The wall needs to be opened up, sistered with new studs. The roof needs flashing and new shingles on the west side. Plumbing's old galvanized pipe. It's all got to go. I can do it. Just like that. No hemming or hawing. Just a declarative statement of capability." It was the most reassuring thing I'd heard in a month. "Okay," I breathed, a wave of relief washing over me. "Yes, please." He looked at me again, that steady, unreadable gaze. This time, it lingered a moment too long. He took in my worn t-shirt, my paint-splattered jeans, the nervous energy I was practically vibrating with. For a split second, I felt utterly exposed, as if he could see the loneliness clinging to me like the dust on the furniture. Then he blinked, and the moment was gone. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "Be here at 7. And so began the rhythm of our days. The rumble of his truck arriving at 7 on the dot was my new alarm clock. The scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pines soon replaced the musty smell of neglect. And the silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of him working, the clean bite of a saw, the solid thud of a hammer, the low murmur of his voice when he occasionally cursed at a stubborn nail. I tried to make myself useful, which mostly meant staying out of his way and keeping a steady supply of coffee brewing. I'd set up my laptop at the kitchen table, pretending to work on freelance projects, but my focus was shot. My gaze kept drifting to him. I watched the play of muscles in his back as he lifted a sheet of drywall. I watched the intense concentration on his face as he measured a piece of trim, his brow furrowed, his lower lip caught between his teeth. He had this habit of pushing his hair back with the heel of his hand, a simple, unconscious gesture that I found inexplicably compelling. I started cataloging these small details, hoarding them like secrets. The way he'd squint against the sun, creating fine lines at the corners of his eyes. The way he smelled when he worked up a sweat, a clean, earthy scent mixed with the faint, sharp tang of the citrus soap he used. Our interactions were brief, mostly functional. "Hand me that level, would you?" "Coffee's fresh," but the space between the words was charged with something I couldn't name. It was in the way he'd hold my gaze for a beat longer than necessary when I passed him a mug. It was in the way his fingers would brush against mine, a spark of warmth that would travel up my arm and settle in my chest. I told myself I was imagining it. I was lonely. He was just a guy doing a job. A handsome, quiet, incredibly competent guy, but a guy doing a job nonetheless. My brain knew this. My body, however, was staging a full-scale rebellion. Every time he moved into my personal space to point something out on a blueprint, the air would get thick and warm, and I'd forget how to breathe normally. One afternoon, I was trying to carry a box of new light fixtures from my car, and I tripped on an exposed root. The box went flying, and I went stumbling forward. Before I could face-plant in the dirt, a hand clamped onto my bicep, steadying me. Another hand landed firmly on the small of my back. It was Cole. He pulled me back against his chest, his body a solid wall of heat behind me. "Whoa there," he said, his voice a low rumble right by my ear. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel the hard planes of his chest, the solid strength in his arm. He smelled like sawdust and sunshine. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen. His hand didn't move from my back. It just rested there, a point of searing heat that seemed to burn right through my shirt. I could feel the individual pressure of each of his fingers. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. He let go, stepping back. "You all right?" "Yeah, fine. Just clumsy," I mumbled, my face burning. I knelt to gather the scattered fixtures, refusing to look at him. My hands were shaking. When I finally risked a glance up, he was already walking back toward the cabin, his back to me. But I saw him lift a hand and run it over the back of his neck, a gesture that seemed, for the first time, not entirely certain. The wall in my living room was no longer bowed. It was straight and true, the fresh drywall a pale, promising canvas. Cole was a miracle worker. He'd transformed the house from a place of decay into a place of potential. He was transforming me, too, though I didn't want to admit it. He was waking up parts of me I'd thought were dormant for good. The project was nearing its end. The thought of the silence returning, this time without the promise of his truck rumbling up the drive, was a physical ache in my chest. I started inventing new tasks. "You know, I was thinking this shelf looks a little crooked. Do you think we should rehang this door?" Cole would just look at me with that knowing, almost smile. "Whatever you want, Leo." One evening, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray. The wind picked up, rattling the newly secured windows in their frames. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, fast and violent. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as Cole was packing up his tools. Then the heavens opened. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned my driveway into a muddy river. "Looks like you're not going anywhere," I said, stating the obvious. My heart gave a hopeful little leap that I tried to ignore. Cole stood at the door, watching the downpour. "Looks like." The power flickered once, twice, and then died. plunging the cabin into a deep twilight gloom. Just us. My heart picked up its pace. "I have candles," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "And a bottle of whiskey." He turned from the door, and in the dim light from the window, I could just make out his expression. "Whiskey sounds good." I fumbled around for the emergency lantern, my hands clumsy. We sat at the kitchen table, the lantern casting a warm, golden circle of light around us, pushing the shadows into the corners. The only sounds were the roar of the rain on the roof and the soft clink of our glasses. The whiskey was cheap, but it burned in a pleasant way, chasing away the chill. For a while, we didn't speak. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was comfortable, companionable. He was just a solid presence across the table, his broad shoulders relaxed, his face softened by the lantern light. He looked less like a contractor and more like just a man. "So," he said finally, his voice a low counterpoint to the storm. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "This is what you wanted? All this quiet?" The question was simple, but it felt loaded. It felt like he was asking about more than just the cabin. I shrugged, looking down at my own glass. I thought it was. The city was loud, crowded. I wanted space to think. "You doing a lot of thinking?" he asked. His gaze was steady, perceptive. It felt like he could see right through the flimsy excuse. "Too much," I admitted, the whiskey making me bold. "My brain is like a browser with too many tabs open." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. A real one. It was a wonderful sound. "I get that. What about you?" I asked, turning the question back on him. "You've lived here your whole life." He nodded. "Born and raised. Never saw a reason to leave. Everything I need is here." He looked around the small cabin, at the new walls and the steady roof. "I like fixing things that are broken, making them solid again." The words hung in the air between us. He was talking about the house. I knew he was talking about the house. But my stupid, hopeful heart heard something else entirely. He was looking at me when he said it. We talked for hours. He told me about growing up in the small town, about learning his trade from his father. I told him about my sterile city life, the endless deadlines, the feeling of being invisible in a crowd of millions. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't tell him about the string of failed dates, the gnawing loneliness that felt like a permanent part of my anatomy. But I felt like he heard it anyway, in the spaces between my words. At some point, the storm passed. The rain softened to a gentle patter and then stopped altogether. The world outside was washed clean and utterly silent. We had finished most of the whiskey. The lantern was starting to dim. A comfortable, hazy exhaustion settled over me. "It's late," I said, my voice thick. "The road will still be a mess. You should probably just stay." The words came out before I could stop them. My cheeks flushed hot. "The guest room is, well, it's a room. The bed is clean, at least." Cole didn't answer right away. He just watched me, his eyes dark and serious in the flickering light. The air grew thick again, charged with all the things we hadn't said. The whiskey, the storm, the enforced intimacy. It had all conspired to strip away our carefully constructed pretenses. He was no longer just the handyman, and I was no longer just the client. We were just two men, sitting in a small cabin in the middle of the woods. "Okay," he said finally, his voice a soft rasp. "Okay, Leo." The work was finished. The last nail had been hammered, the last coat of paint had dried. Cole had spent the day doing final touch-ups, small things I wouldn't have even noticed. There was no excuse for him to stay another night, no storm to blame. The silence I had once craved was looming again, a vast, empty space on the horizon. We ate dinner together, a simple meal of pasta I'd thrown together. The conversation was stilted, awkward. The easy camaraderie of the storm-filled night had vanished, replaced by a tense awareness of the impending goodbye. Every time his arm brushed mine as we reached for the salt, a jolt went through me. He was leaving in the morning. This was it. After we cleared the plates, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. I couldn't stand it. I needed to do something, to perform some act of normalcy to break the tension. "Well," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally bright. I'll go make up the guest room for you." I turned and walked toward the small spare room, my movements stiff. I could feel his eyes on my back. I pulled the clean sheets from the closet, the crisp scent of lavender filling the small space. My hands shook as I unfolded the fitted sheet, my mind racing. This was ridiculous. He was a man who had stayed the night because of a storm. He was my contractor. I was being a good host. It was all perfectly normal. Except it wasn't. Nothing about the way I felt was normal. I was smoothing out the flat sheet, my back to the door, when his voice came from behind me, low and quiet. "What are you doing, Leo?" I froze, my hands clutching the sheet. I didn't turn around. "Making the bed," I said, my voice tight. "For you. So you can get an early start tomorrow." I heard him take a step into the room. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight. He was closer now. The air shifted, growing warmer, thicker. My entire body was on high alert. I could feel the heat of him, even from a few feet away. There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of his breathing, slow and steady. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for him to say thanks and for the night to proceed with this excruciating, polite distance between us. Then he spoke, and the two simple words he said dismantled my entire reality. "Don't bother." My eyes snapped open. I slowly, hesitantly, turned around. He was standing just inside the doorway, his large frame seeming to fill the entire space. His arms were crossed over his chest, but it wasn't a defensive posture. It was deliberate. His face was serious, his gaze intense and unwavering. He was looking right at me, and for the first time, his expression was completely, terrifyingly readable. It was full of the same yearning that had been clawing its way up my own throat for weeks. My mouth went dry. "What?" I whispered. He pushed off the door frame and took another slow step toward me, closing the small distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. He was so close I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He smelled of soap and something uniquely him, a scent I knew I would now associate with the feeling of my world tilting on its axis. He reached out, not quickly, but with a slow, intentional movement that gave me plenty of time to pull away. He didn't touch my face or my arm. His hand went to the sheet I was still clutching, his fingers gently closing over mine. His touch was warm and firm, a solid anchor in my swirling confusion. "I'm not sleeping in there," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that was for me and me alone. My breath hitched. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. This is it. The moment freezes. Time stretches, pulling taut like a rubber band. His thumb strokes the back of my hand, a small, simple movement that sends a shock wave straight through my system. He's not looking at my hand. He's looking at my mouth. He's not sleeping in the guest room. The words echo in my mind, not as a statement of fact, but as a question, a confession, an invitation. And all the air leaves my lungs in a rush. He let go of my hand and lifted his to my face. His calloused palm was rough against my cheek, but the touch was incredibly gentle. He wasn't asking anymore. He was telling me. He leaned in, and the last thing I saw before my eyes fluttered shut was the raw vulnerability in his. His lips were softer than I'd imagined. The kiss wasn't hungry or rushed. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was hesitant at first, a gentle pressure, a test. And then I leaned into it, my hands coming up to grip his forearms, and something shifted. It deepened, becoming more sure, more certain. It tasted of whiskey and coffee and weeks of unspoken tension. It was the sound of a wall I hadn't even realized I'd built around my heart finally crumbling to dust. It wasn't a kiss of explosive passion. It was a kiss of relief. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, long journey. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. We stood there, in the middle of the half-made bed in the guest room he would not be sleeping in, just breathing each other's air. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time he'd said my name like it meant something. "Cole," I breathed back. There was nothing else to say. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, and led me out of the room, leaving the rumpled sheets and the silent question of the guest bed behind us. He led me to my room, to my bed, and the whole way I couldn't stop looking at our joined hands. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. I woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a disorienting moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the whiskey, the confession in the guest room, the quiet, earth-shattering kiss. I turned my head, a knot of panic tightening in my stomach. The other side of the bed was empty. My heart sank. A cold, familiar dread washed over me. Of course, it was a mistake. A whiskey-fueled moment of madness. He was embarrassed. He'd slipped out before the sun was even up to avoid the awkward morning after. I closed my eyes, the ache in my chest sharp and painful. The silence of the cabin was back, and it was worse than ever before, filled with the ghost of his presence. I lay there for a long time, listening to the silence, willing it to be broken by the sound of his truck starting, so I could at least have the certainty of him being gone. But there was nothing, just the gentle chirping of early morning birds. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I forced myself out of bed, pulling on a pair of sweatpants, my movements slow and heavy, as if I were wading through water. The cabin was quiet. His work boots were gone from their spot by the door. His jacket wasn't on the hook. The knot in my stomach tightened. I walked into the kitchen, steeling myself for the sight of an empty room, a note left on the table. But the room wasn't empty. The scent of coffee hit me first, rich and dark. And there, standing on the porch just outside the open kitchen door, was Cole. He was leaning against the railing, a mug cradled in his hands, watching the sunrise paint the sky in strokes of pink and orange. He was wearing his jeans from the night before, but he was barefoot. His boots were sitting neatly on the mat outside. He hadn't left. He must have heard me, because he turned his head. His eyes met mine, and the guarded, unreadable expression was gone. In its place was a quiet, gentle watchfulness. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Morning," he said. His voice was that same low rumble, but this morning it sounded like comfort. It sounded like safety. I couldn't speak. I just stood there in the doorway, my heart doing a slow, painful flip in my chest. All my carefully constructed fears, all the scenarios of rejection I had spent the last 20 minutes torturing myself with, evaporated in the warm morning light. He straightened up from the railing and patted the empty space beside him on the top step. An invitation. I walked out onto the porch, the cool wood smooth beneath my bare feet, and sat down next to him. He didn't say anything else, just handed me his mug. The ceramic was warm. I took a sip. The coffee was strong, just the way I liked it. Of course it was. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, burning the last of the mist off the mountains. It was a different kind of silence than the one I had grown to hate. This silence was full. It was shared. It was peaceful. The space between us was no longer charged with tension, but with a quiet, settled intimacy. Finally, I had to break it. I had to know. "The job's done," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't look at him. I just stared out at the trees. It was a test. A final, terrifying question. I felt him shift beside me. He took the mug from my hands and set it down on the porch. Then he took my hand in his. His grasp was warm, solid, and sure. "The job is," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not." I turned to look at him then. He was looking at me with such open, honest affection that it stole the breath from my lungs. There was no game, no pretense. Just him. Just us. He lifted my hand and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "I was thinking," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "That front step is a little loose. It'll probably take me a while to fix it." A laugh bubbled up out of my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. A long while," he confirmed, his eyes twinkling with that mischievous light I had only seen glimpses of before. "Might have to stay over a few more nights to get it just right." We ended up making breakfast together. We moved around the small kitchen in an easy, unspoken dance. He cooked bacon while I scrambled eggs. His arm would brush against my back as he reached for a plate, and instead of flinching away, I would lean into the touch. It felt right. It felt like we'd been doing this for years. Later, as we sat at the kitchen table, the sun streaming in through the clean window, I looked around the small cabin. I looked at the straight walls, the solid roof, the man sitting across from me who had fixed more than just the house. He had fixed the silence. He had filled the empty spaces. I had come out here seeking solitude, thinking that was what I needed to heal myself. But I was wrong. I hadn't needed to be alone. I had just needed to be with the right person. I looked at Cole, who was smiling at something I'd said, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. It was the feeling of a lock finally clicking into place. It was the feeling of coming home.